Hi, this is Chris Woodfield with the Program Committee. I wanted to thank you all for joining again for day 3 of the virtual NANOG. As always, please remember to fill in your surveys with the new format. We're very interested in your feedback, much more than we usually are right now. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Bill Woodcock. Bill is the Executive Director of Packet Clearinghouse, which has provided the domain name service for .org since 2004. He is also on the Board of Directors of CCOR, the Cooperative Corporation of .org Registrants. And with that, thank you, Bill, and you have the mic.
Thanks, Chris. Howdy, everybody. I'm going to try to be fairly interactive today. I've got some slides, but they're mostly just there to kind of give you a reference in case you want to dig further into any of the history of this, or look at links or whatever. So please feel free to submit questions anytime during the session, and if it's about what I'm talking about right then, I'll try and work in the answer, and otherwise we'll aggregate them up and hit them at the end. But I would like to do as much Q&A as possible. So you may remember that there was a lot in the news from sort of last November up until we had a pandemic about .org, and .org being subject to an attempted hostile takeover by a private equity firm. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the history of .org and why it's particularly interesting relative to the 2,000 other top-level domains out there. It is the third largest of the GTLDs at 11 million registrants. So it's a big and significant domain just from numbers perspective. It's also one of the original generic top-level domains, which means it's been around for a long time and is sort of very enmeshed in what makes the internet. And it's also interesting that a lot of people think of .org as being a bunch of little do-gooders off in the corner somewhere, but it's the United Nations, it's the World Bank, it's the IATA, right? Like International Air Traffic Control is coordinated over .org domains. It's the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders, and thousands and thousands of other really large, significant nonprofits. It's also your kids' weekend football league. It's the church on the corner. It's the neighborhood social club. So it's pervasive in a way that I think people don't often think about, and they don't realize just how many organizations are dependent on .org for their online identity. So with all that, I'm going to try and give you a little bit of background about how .org got to where it was, how it fell off a cliff, and how we are sort of grabbed it as it went over and are hanging on to it by the back of its pants or whatever. And what next steps would look like to actually get it back on solid ground. So .org was originally defined in RFC 920. That was back in October of 1984, along with the other big ones, ComNet, Gov, Edu, Mill, and ARPA with the NADR in it. It was, I'm sorry, I have notes here that I can't quite see without, there we go. So the idea was that it was going to be sort of entrusted to someone to operate, but it wasn't going to be their property, right? Operating it was a responsibility, not a prize. And at that time, all of those top-level domains were the NIC. The DARPA Network Information Center was sort of handling the registry for all of them, and the DNS for all of them, and so forth. And so then we've got a 10-year period where not much changes. There are very few people on the internet. Most of those are at universities. Everybody is just waiting for OSI to come and kick the crap out of the internet because, the internet is just a bunch of academics. And then, it starts to become clear that it's going to be something big, and it is growing. We have the NII, the National Information Infrastructure Plan, that privatizes the operation of the internet. And by 1994, it becomes apparent that, a restructuring of some sort is going to be needed. And people are very excited about the commercial prospects of the internet at this point. So a lot of people are really thinking .com is going to be everything, right? So a lot of worry at this point is that everything is going to register in .com. None of the other top-level domains are going to get used, and they're going to have to find a way of subdividing .com. So you go from .org being the home for organizations and nonprofits and non-governmental stuff to miscellaneous TLD. Some non-government organizations may fit here, right? There's no change being described, but there's sort of an offhandedness to the way it's assigned, its use is assigned. The important thing in the 1994 RFC 1591 is that the role of the registry is really much more clearly defined, right? We go from a situation where there's only one, and it's assumed that eventually there will be more, to a situation where that, more is almost imminent, right? Like everybody recognizes that everything's exploding, and it's not just going to be the internet doing it all. So we see this phrase that the registry is a trustee of the domain, and they have a duty to serve the internet community. And then there's this really specific language saying that rights and ownership are inappropriate ways of thinking about it, and responsibility is what you need to think about, right? That this is a responsibility to the internet community. It's not something that you own. It's not something that you can derive a private benefit from. So, that said, we go for a few more years, another 8 years, with the transition from the internet to network solutions. And network solutions is, of course, a for-profit company. Sorry, I'll just sort of flip through the slides here about the how it's to be governed. The other interesting point here is that it's pretty clear in RFC 1591 that changes in who the registry is what registry is chosen to operate .org are to be made, or at least significantly made, by the registrants, by the nonprofit community, not as a business interest, not by ICANN arbitrarily. Well, sorry, it's not ICANN yet in 94. ICANN shows up in 98. But there needs to be a registrant-driven selection process. That's made really clear in that RFC. So then September 98, ICANN is formed to take over the sort of domain name industry governance role, be a home for the IATA going forward. And multi-stakeholderism is cited as the mechanism by which governance decisions are going to be made. And there's a lot of talk about bottom-up decision-making and about the community doing the decision-making, and that is really the foundation on which capture is going to be prevented, right? That the community is in charge, so the community is not going to let somebody come along and capture its resources. then we get to July of 2002, and a deal is struck whereby Network Solutions will keep the com and net domains if they give up .org. They're sort of given the choice of what to propose to do, and .org is the smallest of the three, the least revenue of the three, so that's the one that they say they're going to give up. And it makes sense, right? Because it's for nonprofits. They already don't have .edu at that point, which is the other sort of very specific one of these, because .net, by this point, by 2002, people were already registering all kinds of junk at .net. It was no longer just accepting internet infrastructure the way it was defined to be. So the URL that's at the top of your screen right now is a really, really interesting read, because this is the outcome of the selection process, and it tells you about how the selection process was run. I struggle to find a useful analogy that helps people outside the internet governance community really get what this is like. But the best I've come across or the best I've thought of is, in a lot of countries that don't have their own space program, it's really prestigious to be the astronaut from that country or the first astronaut from that country. And so there's this selection process that happens in a lot of countries to pick the first astronaut for the country. And so there are criteria that get established, a lot of criteria. There, must be reasonably athletic, must be able to hang upside down, must not throw up in weightless whatever, must have first aid training, stuff like that. There's, the sort of academic criteria, right? Must have a physics doctorate, must be willing to do press events, must be willing to go to grade schools and talk to kids and make them excited about it, right? And so then you get a sort of first pass of looking for volunteers, making sure that they sort of meet the basic criteria, and then you've got a beauty pageant, right? You've got a sort of a contest between all the candidates that meet the basic criteria to figure out which one is actually best, not just meeting the basic criteria, but actually the best of the bunch. And that's really what the process looked like in 2002. There was a multi-stakeholder process to develop the criteria by which the new registry would be selected. And a lot of criteria were put forward, some were dropped. The multi-stakeholder process did its thing, and eventually we got to a set of criteria. And then an RFP was issued, and 11 proposals came in. And then the multi-stakeholder community went out and evaluated the 11 proposals against the criteria that had been established, and they assigned points, and the points were weighted, and then, we saw who got the most points. So we've got these sort of major criteria, and the first of these was differentiation. And I'm not going to read all this to you, but the upshot of this was they came up with this table of, points assigned to different parts of differentiation and, added up and so forth. And there was this really clear winner called Unity, which was a joint effort by a association of nonprofit cooperatives and OS registry. The .au registry was providing the technical backend. And you see, Newstar at tied for number 3 with ISC, Internet Systems Consortium, then Internet Software Consortium, and Internet Society at 5, and a bunch of other ones that were sort of thrown together in more of a hurry further down. And then there was responsiveness. This is sort of looking at how well the organization was proposing to communicate with nonprofits about their needs, with the registrants, see what they wanted and do it. Again, big table, lots of argument, points assigned, so forth. And again, unity comes out as the highest one. And then there was support, which is how many people and organizations wrote in saying, yes, we're a nonprofit and we think this is the one that should be selected. And so they had to kind of do this one a little bit more on the fly to, once they got all the letters of support, to say how they would be sorted out. And so what they came to was this, Class A versus Class B endorsements, and Class A were weighted 5 times as high as Class B. Class B was sort of, just random folks or, interested parties. Class A was actual nonprofit organizations that were .org registrants. And so then again, they did this ranking. ISC was really well known. Obviously, the publishers of Bind, Paul Vixie's organization at the time, and they were really well liked. They got no nonprofits supporting them, but 420 individuals supporting them. And Unity came out number 2, and ISOC came out number 3 because they got all the ISOC chapters to write in individually, and so all those got demoted from A to B because they were interested parties. And so then, there's and in this document, there's a lot of discussion of all of this, right? It's fascinating reading. I'm not going to try and summarize it all. So the question then is, how did we wind up with ISOC instead of Unity, right? How was it that they picked one from the middle of the pack rather than the points leader? The answer is that there were 17 people on the ICANN board, and 7 of those were also ISOC leadership, and they didn't recuse themselves. And those 7 included both the chair and the vice chair of ICANN at the time. So, one hopes that if this process is run again, or when this process is run again, and we have a selection, that the good multi-stakeholderism will happen again, right? That the multi-stakeholder process will be followed, but that ICANN will be a lot more cognizant of conflicts of interest and a lot more aware of, who the stakeholder community is versus, ICANN's role as a facilitator of the process, not as sort of the final arbiter. So it took a couple of years to actually get things switched over from network solutions to ISOC, created a subsidiary, PIR outsourced to Affiliates outsourced to Newstar outsourced to PCH. Kind of deep chain there. So it took a couple of years to actually get that to the point where it was working. And then things basically ran relatively unchanged for quite a while. Now, if you poke around in the press from sort of December, January timeframe, there was a bunch of analysis of the public financial documents around .org, number of registrants, and how much was being charged and where that money was going, because the publicly stated rationale for giving this to ISOC rather than to Unity was that Unity was just going to operate it for nonprofits, but ISOC was going to take the profits and use them to fund the IETF. And so at first, that was in fact a significant portion of the revenue. But over time, it's become a trivially small portion. And the press did a fair amount of analysis of that if you're interested, you can go dig into that. Operational costs, climbed over time as the number of domains grew, but honestly, it's not so much about the number of domains. It's much more about how many people are trying to reach .org domains, which is proportional to the number of internet users, and even more, how much people are trying to attack .org domains. DDoS is what you have to build for, not actual DNS queries. If we're just actual DNS queries, all this stuff would be trivial, right? The number of actual queries associated with these things are, low in the tens of thousands a second. But you have to be able to withstand tens of millions a second in order to keep everything working during the DDoS. So all that went along. And during this time, the better part of 20 years, ICANN went through a whole bunch of CEOs and a whole bunch of turnover in the board. And I'll be really blunt, they got really, really captured by the domain name industry during this time. So ICANN went from being something that everyone clearly understood to be a regulator in the public interest to something that looks a lot more like a club of registry service providers. And so Fadi Chehadi was the CEO for a while. He was the second to last CEO, second to current. And he spearheaded an effort to, along with ICANN's legal department, to make all domains uniform, to treat every domain exactly the same way from a contractual perspective. And this is really problematic, right? Because if there's not really a point in having multiple domains if they're all going to be treated exactly the same. If somebody in .ca is actually in Mozambique, .ca doesn't mean Canada anymore. If somebody in .org is actually selling tires, it doesn't really mean a nonprofit anymore. So that was stripped out. The price caps that had been in place since the outset of the sort of commercialization of the internet, those got stripped out. But also the, sorry, cover that. Anyway, so July 2019, July last year, the price caps get pulled off. Fadi is already gone at that point. He has exited through the revolving door. And a day later, after the price caps are pulled, he registers the Ethos Capital domain name. And of course, nobody's really looking, so nobody knows or cares, right, at that point. But there'd been this sort of long, slow bidding war of private interests approaching ISOC and saying, hey, that .org thing that you guys don't really know what to do with, I get that you're making a lot of money on it, but we could give you a big chunk right now. And ISOC, was sort of slowly entertaining these over time and not discouraging them, but also not quite biting. But then the price cap being lifted, that was the signal that sort of sent all of those bidders into a frenzy. And so the offers went from being in the sort of 300 million range to, it turns out, 1.1 billion, which is interesting because before before the price was announced, what the winning bid had been, a lot of people looked at this and, did the math and said, well, this should be somewhere between $300 and $400 million, right? That's a rational price. And interestingly, the banks that financed the private equity companies that gave them the low interest, comparatively low interest loans to make this happen, they also came to the same conclusion. They weren't willing, with a fully collateralized loan, to loan more than $360 million. And Elizabeth Warren's financial analysts came to the same number, somewhere in the high threes. I ran the numbers and came to 405. So that's what it was worth if you weren't going to strip mine, if you were going to try and operate it responsibly, if you were going to pay the operational costs without degrading anything and, not start selling personal data. So there are tens of thousands of folks wrote in. One of the things that we figured out that's really interesting, and this is sort of a hack that anybody can do. ICANN has a correspondence webpage, and people watch that. And any letter that you send to ICANN or any email, if you say you want it published on the correspondence webpage, it goes on there, and people see it. And previously, nobody really used that very much. There was very little correspondence other than sort of technical rigmarole between the regulated entities and ICANN. But, a whole lot of big nonprofits wrote in, and governmental and intergovernmental organizations that were in .org. And eventually, the California State Attorney General writes in and says, hey, ICANN, remember the reason why you are an artificial legal person in California as a nonprofit is to operate in the public interest. And you're not doing that. So wake up. But this conversation just keeps going on and on. ICANN keeps sort of going back and forth with Ethos, hoping that somehow magically they're going to turn into something good. That, of course, doesn't happen. The California AG has to write a second time. And then the ICANN board punted and said, well, we're not going to say yes to a deal that Fadi put together because that would be insider, self-dealing, revolving door, horrible corruption, blah, blah, blah. But you're welcome to come back with the next highest bidder. So that's where we are right now. The problem is sort of on hold. The other bidders, whoever the second bidder was, is undoubtedly having very interesting conversations with Andrew Sullivan. Everybody else is presumably trying to figure out whether they can up their bid. And ISOC is undoubtedly, and obviously I can't speak for ISOC, but trying to figure out, how long do they cool their heels before they bring the next thing back? Because their board voted for this unanimously. And they've said in a lot of public statements that, there's no way that they would turn down $1 billion offer. And, when you get into a bidding war like this, people don't up their bids by $100 million at a time, right? Which means that the second and third bidders are undoubtedly also well over $1 billion. So, yeah, let's go to Q&A. What do you guys have? Is there anything to do towards reducing the influence of big domain registrar money in the system? Yeah, well, I think the big one there is just what the California AG said. This is supposed to be operating in the public interest. If you can't show that you're operating in the public interest, the remedy there is it's not a legal person anymore, and its assets get handed off to something else. Now, that's a hell of a big stick. And there would be a lot of people who would be hugely pissed off at the U.S. government, not really understanding the difference between federal and state and blah, 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 right? Because the whole rest of the world depends on ICANN right now.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut off the feed.
All right.
Yeah, we're over time.
I'll try and post answers to questions, however the mechanism is. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Take care
Okay.
of you.
Thank you.